It is Monday, June the 29th, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, MonuMentality. Yeah, today we're going to talk about monuments. A lot of this was on my mind when I was researching and reading for Gone with the Wind, but all lasting pieces of art are monuments in a sense. We'll discuss things a bit more narrowly today, but broad enough, I think. But of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you, folks who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. There's also a PayPal link at paypal.me/distantpeasant. Thank you to each and every one of my supporters who allows me to take time out of my days. Instead of working as a delivery driver to pay the bills, I can do this a little bit. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. Sorry it takes me a little bit longer to get these put together. Partially it's because I share an office space now during pandemic times. Speaking of those times, I hope you and yours are keeping well, or as well as can be expected. Please take care of each other and yourselves as best you can. On with the show. Monuments are not studied as historical sources for the people and events they actually depict. Not by anyone with any sense, anyway. They always intend to tell the story of what they are about, true, but for the discerning, they always end up telling a story instead about the people who put them up, and the people who gazed upon them. They do convey ideas, whatever the truth of them, but the measure of that truth should demand examination, not absorption. And this requires contextualization in time and space, yet ultimately some sort of judgment of the worth of those ideas. Monuments have a great deal to teach for those who know what to learn from them, who put them up and why, and also the manner of their destruction or alteration can be very revealing. Lamented natural disaster, malign or benign neglect, domestic revolutionary force, a foreign conquering army, spontaneous and uncoordinated action. In each of these cases, it would tell you something about the crises or changes going on in that society. In the spirit of this, long ago and far away, once upon a time, there was a very important man. In fact, he was so important he was the sole emperor of Rome. In 193 of the Common Era, 5 men were hailed as emperor of Rome, and after a series of bloody assassinations and civil wars that lasted until 197, this man was on top of the heap, founder of a new imperial dynasty. He had won the purple because of his martial abilities. He was a general from North Africa, but his greatest victories had come in civil wars against other Romans. And for this, and because of their support for one of the rival claimants to the purple, he invaded the Parthian Empire to the east. He sacked the royal city of Ctesiphon, and he took many slaves. Nothing says, "I'm a winner, stick with me," like winning does. And it was in the spirit of this that he erected a big marble arch in Rome in 203 to remind everyone there who has the favor of the gods and people of Rome, and who will ever after, with this inscription to him and his son and co-ruler, quote, "To the Emperor, Caesar, Lucius, Septimius Severus, Pius Pertinax, Augustus Parthicus, Arabicus Parthicus, Adiabenicus, son of Marcus, father of his country, Pontifex Maximus, in the 11th year of his tribunitian power, in the 11th year of his rule, consul thrice and proconsul, and to the Emperor Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, Antoninus, Augustus, Pius Felix, son of Lucius, in the 6th year of his tribunitian power, consul and proconsul, fathers of their country, the best and bravest emperors, on account of the restored republic and the rule of the Roman people spread by their outstanding virtues at home and abroad, the Senate and the people of Rome dedicate this monument," end quote. Except originally the inscription read a bit differently. In fact, the whole arch has marks in it, where some of the figures carved into it have been scratched out. and the monument used to be topped by 3 statues and not 2, Septimius Severus and his 2 sons. Now the one son, after assassinating his younger brother in 212, damned his memory and likeness forever. Another message for the people of Rome on the monument, beyond saying, no, really, it was just these 2 conquering guys who rule here who did it. It also says, see how there's just a formless void, where it looks like there used to be another dude. That's just how we roll in the Severan dynasty, so remember that, if you ever start thinking about fucking with it. For the record, the Severan dynasty won't last 40 years. As it originally arose to power through military conquest, so too would a series of barracks emperors in 235. 5 emperors a year might seem like a lot, but in 238 they had 6, each with nothing but the backing of an army to signify legitimacy. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, I read somewhere once. And yet the Romans made the monument anyway, nothing but a symbol, nothing dangerous about it. Went to a great deal of trouble to do it too. These are ancient peoples, with incredibly limited technology after all, and basically nothing more powerful than the muscles of animals and humans to employ when building such a thing. The trouble they went to says a lot about the people who put it up. The main thing being that they greatly valued foreign conquest, and that the Romans were politically unstable at the highest levels, their ruling class unable to safely manage who would be emperor and when, not even long enough to decide who or what was worth memorializing about them. But to let you know, the arch itself has survived to the present day pretty well. It was incorporated into the structure of a Catholic church in the Middle Ages, which kept it safe from demolition, and increased the local desire to preserve it for a long time. Another chapter of world history that can be viewed through the lens of monuments. Much closer to us today in both time and space in America, but still pretty far away, in 1859, John Brown led a famous raid into Harper's Ferry, then in the state of Virginia, a raid that ultimately led him and his band to first defending the Federal Armory building and then the Fire Engine House. That latter building became known as John Brown's Fort. Much later on in history in that building, a plaque was placed in 1918 which reads the following, quote, that this nation might have a new burst of freedom, that slavery should be removed forever from American soil. John Brown and his 21 men gave their lives. To commemorate their heroism, this tablet is placed on this building, which has since been known as John Brown's Fort by the alumni of Storber College, 1918. End quote. Those alumni were graduates of a school that had begun as a one-room enterprise, teaching newly freed slaves to read and write, and was still 2 decades away in 1918 from granting 4-year degrees. That's all just to make clear these were largely educated working-class black people who placed the plaque. It wasn't just the intellectually or material elite of the black community who wanted to honor a white man they thought died for their sake, in a brilliant flash that was both a spectacular failure and a spectacular success. People often speak of what quote-unquote everyone knew about race at the time, that it was just the consensus of the literate people of the United States that John Brown was a crazed maniac, not just for his tactics, but for his ideals. That's only mostly true if you don't consider black people to be people, I think. And it always irks me a bit when I hear it. There's a great deal both superficially and fundamentally different about the Arch of Septimius Severus and this plaque to Brown, but they are certainly both monuments in a sense, and can tell us something about who and what the people who erected them valued and were like, and the time and place in which they lived. For Septimius Severus, the new man attempting to found a lasting imperial dynasty to rule the glory of Rome, emphasizing his foreign military conquests and the importance and value of his sons was the important thing. For his older son, all of that was still true of the monument, except any bits about his younger brother. Those must be erased, and their erasure will carry a weight all their own. For the men who erected this humbler plaque, in a literate society, and much more similar to us today than an ancient Roman emperor, they put it well enough on the plaque itself. John Brown and those who fight the subjugation of the little guy across racial lines damn the consequences. Well, he was no misguided but well-meaning fanatic, but a hero. The following is just my editorial, But there are few things as reprehensible to committed American white supremacists than monuments like this. Not much arouses their venom like the celebration of a white man who would fight and die for the rights of a black person. And understandably so, I think, for such interracial coalitions are existential threats to their power in the world. And the natural counter to such, in 1918 at Harper's Ferry, for the committed American Southern white supremacists at the time, were faithful slave monuments. There is no reason to oppose racial caste systems because they are beneficial to slave and slave master alike. The first of these was not laid at Harper's Ferry, nor would be the last, but as far as I could tell, the vast majority of them, and perhaps all of them save this one, are not to specific people. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, a hateful and disgusting organization that continues to operate to this very day, and is most possessive of the MonuMentality mindset, literally struggled for years in response to this humble plaque as they searched high and low for the best and most emblematic example of a faithful slave they could find, and struggled still further to find somewhere in Harper's Ferry to put up a monument to them. The best the Faithful Slave Memorial Committee could come up with was Haywood Shepherd, the first casualty and black man killed by John Brown's raiders. They told him to halt, he bolted and ran, he was shot, lingered about a day before dying. This act became a faithful slave running to warn the whites about devilish John Brown, who lost his life for his fealty. Now, some fun facts about the monument to the faithful slave Haywood Shepherd. He was a free man when he was killed who owned property and was legally married when he was killed. There is no evidence to support that he was ever enslaved, though of course he could have been emancipated at some point, which would have been a rare occurrence in Virginia at the time. Now, more certain is that he knew shit all about what was happening or why John Brown was shooting at him. He had panicked and ran when unfamiliar armed men approached the train station he minded late at night, and was not filled with faithfulness and concern for white people when he was shot. His death was a tragedy, but not one with much meaning to be gleaned regarding racial egalitarianism's worth. They also misspelled his name on the granite slab. It was Haywood, not Hayward, when it was finally erected in 1931, after much controversy and opposition. It reads, quote, "On the night of October 16th, 1859, Haywood Shepherd, an industrious and respected colored freeman, was mortally wounded by John Brown's raiders. In pursuance of his duties as an employee of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, he became the first victim of this attempted insurrection. This boulder is erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of the Confederate Veterans as a memorial to Haywood Shepherd, exemplifying the character and faithfulness of thousands of Negroes who, under many temptations throughout subsequent years of war, so conducted themselves that no stain was left upon a record, which is the peculiar heritage of the American people, and an everlasting tribute to the best in both races." End quote. Ugh. As soon as it was up, the black community immediately challenged it. It's often said that we shouldn't judge the consensus of the past. That's a shame, but everyone was kind of stupid about this stuff back then, more racist and segregationist than we are today, and it's true, we've made some progress on race relations. But there have always been those who didn't accept this consensus on race. And a few of them were white, but far more numerous were black people, many of whom knew that consensus to be horseshit for piglet-ass white people. Hopefully this isn't really news to anyone listening, but slaves don't like being slaves. And in America, things were no different in this regard. The vast majority of slaves were employed in the fields, and if they could escape during the Civil War, they did. Or during the war, they ran the plantation themselves, now on their own terms and conditions, of course. Many ex-slaves took up arms for the Union in the Civil War, and many more resisted in more limited but still important ways. And it was actually the lack of faithful slaves that caused the Confederacy to lose the war in some significant part, because such slaves require policing and management at a time when men who can mete out violence are desperately needed to shoot Yankees in order for the rebellion to succeed. When slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction was still within living memory for more people, it wasn't always so easy to successfully define it all through these lost cause enthusiasts. people remember well enough what they had fought for themselves and lived through themselves. And the progress that occurred in this nation towards racial equality achieved some of its greatest gains when it was a racially integrated effort. Soldiers from all over the North and South of every color fought for the Union Army for various reasons, but whatever those reasons were, all knew by the end of the war that it was fought to end slavery. And for many of them, John Brown was the first soldier in that army. A counter to this counter memorial, written by a friend of the show W.E.B. Du Bois, was ready to go by 1932, but the white president of Storer College, who had participated in the UDC dedication to faithful slave Haywood Shepherd, refused to allow its display. The National Park Service would finally allow it to be dedicated in 2006. At this point, even the space to publicly display their own monuments was denied to the black community, and the excuse given was that the copy was too militant, written as it was, as a response to the idea that the violence and brutality of chattel slavery produced multitudes of happy slaves. Quote, "Here, John Brown aimed at human slavery a blow that woke a guilty nation. With him fought 7 slaves and sons of slaves. Over his crucified corpse marched 200,000 black soldiers and 4 million freedmen singing, 'John Brown's body lies a-moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on.' In gratitude, this tablet is erected the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, May 21st, 1932." End quote. Still, even if they wouldn't let the black community display such a plaque, as early as 1955, the National Park Service felt forced to contextualize the Haywood Shepherd Memorial, though it's about as blandly straightforward without mentioning race as it can be. This 1955 plaque read, quote, "John Brown's raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry caused the death of 4 townspeople. One of those who died in the fighting was Haywood Shepherd, a railroad baggage master and a free black. Although the identity of his assailant is uncertain, Shepherd soon became a symbol of the faithful servant among those who deplored Brown's action against the traditional Southern way of life. The monument, placed here in 1931, reflects those traditional views." End quote. About 40 years later, another plaque was placed by the Park Service, which at least mentions slavery, though it also makes no effort to oppose the original's lost cause propaganda. It still stands today and reads, quote, "On October 17th, 1859, abolitionist John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry to launch a war against slavery. Haywood Shepherd, a free African-American railroad baggage master, was shot and killed by Brown's men shortly after midnight. 72 years later, on October 10th, 1931, a crowd estimated to 300 whites and 100 blacks gathered to unveil and dedicate the Shepherd Monument. During the ceremony, voices rose to praise and denounce the monument. Conceived around the turn of the century, the monument endured controversy. In 1905, the United Daughters of the Confederacy stated that erecting the monument would influence for good the present and coming generations and prove that the people of the South who owned slaves valued and respected their good qualities, as no one else ever did or will do." End quote. Again, this plaque still stands and makes absolutely no mention of whether the United Daughters of the Confederacy were right about whether or not slave masters valued and respected the good qualities of the people they owned, as no one else ever did or will do. Here is some interesting shit. Now, it doesn't take much to convince me personally that slaves don't enjoy being slaves and would rather be free. But believe it or not, some opposition to the Faithful Slave Memorial also came from within the United Daughters of the Confederacy itself. According to their own records, shared in contemporaneous correspondence with each other, multiple local chapter heads calculated the percentage of slaves who remained with their owners through war and emancipation as around 10%. And many of these racist biddies thought the black people of the 20th century America didn't deserve a monument to their faithfulness to their white owners, which actually turned out to be shit. Such people would never appreciate the memorialization of devoted servitude anyway, they reckoned. Another fun fact, at around the same time, the Sons of Confederate Veterans was looking around desperately for a black Confederate soldier to memorialize, and similarly failed to find anyone. Though in both cases, the desire to send a message won out over any qualms about having literally no examples to point to, and in both cases, later in the 20th century, they will be giving these searches another good try. So, all horseshit, of course, and were I a lesser internet lib historian, here I would drop Mike. It isn't true. It's a false history created by racists. It's bad, it's white supremacist, and it should be taken down. And it's all just so. I would never dream of arguing against any of that. But that's just the point. The story of this monument to a faithful slave who is not a slave and perhaps never was is ridiculously sloppy, lost cause propaganda. People knew it at the time, and every effort to contextualize the monument by the National Park Service has been a dismal failure. And it all began as a response to a simple memorial, just a plaque on the building old Captain Brown made his last stand in. They were not masters of government when they erected that plaque. They were not influential and respected in the halls of power. They had no friends in the elite offices and businesses of the land. And yet, they wanted a memorial to send a message from the past into the future about who and what they valued and why. A monument tells you nothing for certain about what it's about, but can still tell you something about who put it up and why. What they valued enough to communicate, and to whom and why. It's up to you to decide whether or not you're down with that. In the same way, when monuments come down, this can tell you something about the world in which they come down. Whether they are lost through lamented disaster or conscious neglect, whether they are altered or destroyed by a conquering army or the local population of the domestic government. And if I were looking back upon the Hayward Shepherd Memorial, from as far away as I look upon the Arch of Septimius Severus, I would see a society in schizophrenia, and an elite desperate to counter the narrative that it is heroic and memorable for a white person to give their lives for a black person, and tellingly unable to do so with any fealty to the truth. That narrative was for the white community itself, for the myth of the faithful slave is to desperately remind the white community itself that they need not bother contemplating an alternative life in which one's skin color brands them forever as always separate and less. Anyway, I was talking about the obliteration of monuments. On May 30th, 2020, the national headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia was attacked by protesters of police brutality and set ablaze. The building is marble-clad, so it's not like the whole thing went up in smoke, and depending on one's point of view, this is either fortunate or more's the pity. I'll let you guess as to which side I fall on. Still, the protesters got to the library and burned up some precious memorabilia of some of the country's bloodiest traitors. Stonewall Jackson's personal Confederate flag is now dust in the wind, for example. And much of the inside of the building has been damaged by smoke and fire. The large statue of Robert E. Lee near the headquarters was relentlessly tagged, ACAB, Black Lives Matter, etc. Personally, my favorite graffiti slogan on it is, "How much more blood?" A question which can be taken as worth asking for peasant and lord alike. This statue is scheduled for imminent removal, along with several other statues to Confederates in the area. By the way, these statues are a bit too big for protesters to easily break apart or destroy, but there are many more monuments less durable. This is a less democratic and lawful action to remove a hateful piece of racist propaganda by the city government than a recognition by government officials that such statues are going to be vandalized and attacked until they're destroyed either way. This is rarely noted by anyone across this political spectrum talking about this shit in America, but just concerning the narrow issue of taking down monuments, it just isn't the case that these are crowds of angry anarchists who refuse to channel their grievance into a legitimate and lawful institution. These are expressions of popular will that has been thwarted. For long before there are ever any large crowds of people willing to risk arrest and personal danger to themselves to destroy a statue, there are always waves of petitioners, piles of letters, community meetings, peaceful entreaties, and demonstrations. I have yet to encounter a single campaign or effort to remove a monument that begins with massive crowds willing to take the law into their own hands. And though the destruction of monuments is far removed from the original catalyst for these uprisings, this is all still an expression of the same basic truth, that our country's public institutions, our councils and legislatures, our governors, mayors, presidents, representatives, courts, all of it, none of it's really worth a damn for actually getting anything done that most people want done. And in this, they have about as much democratic legitimacy as Septimius Severus. The vast majority of our country's monuments, Confederate or national, are to capital G, capital P, great people. Judges, governors, presidents, generals, of course the nation's vaunted businessmen. And this is the vast majority of the time, for the vast majority of people, the model they have in mind when they think of monuments. And in that atmosphere, it's understandable that an inclination to obliterate any and all monuments to humanity, given that our examples seem so universally terrible in this country, and ideally erect nothing but abstract expressionism and gestures towards the majesty of nature, I'm sympathetic. Unironically, I support statues like this everywhere. And practically speaking, the following may be a bit of a distinction without a difference for the moment, but I would leave a bit of room in my heart for earnestness. For one thing, you're never going to stop people from wanting to make statues to other people, and it is possible to pick out and celebrate someone who embodied an idea and fought for a better world that we can approve of, even if they themselves were limited by the material conditions in which they were formed. Looking back through the whole of history at who tends to hold up a bit better and who doesn't, in my opinion, very generally the trend is towards a deep and universal secular humanism, a belief in the worth of all humans, and the courage and cleverness to work against ideologies opposing this universal love wherever one can. This is not to say that such things can't be expressed through the language of spirituality and religion, but there's no universality there, for there are too many factions vying for the part. John Brown was a deeply religious and Christian man, and so was many a slaveholder in the South, to say nothing of other religious traditions or atheists, but call it spiritually ecumenical, if the phrase secular humanism doesn't fit to you. Memorials and monuments to people like this, especially when erected under truly democratic and popular force, well, maybe it rarely happens now. Maybe it never really happens now. But it seems possible and desirable to me. My Platonic ideal of a Civil War memorial is something like John Brown and Frederick Douglass simultaneously shooting a slave master in his brain, while a Union soldier observes approvingly, because I think a cross-racial effort to bring about a new burst of freedom with the guns of the state was worth celebrating. This is my monumentality concerning humanity, and you are kidding yourself if you don't think that you have one too. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate that. It's amazing that anyone does that. No monuments are an expression of power and not the source. This is all been second tier. Taking them down is good, of course. Just been sensing a bit of nihilism about monuments in general, that any positive vision of the world is cringe. My sort of irony-poisoned media environment. I think that all that deserves pushing back occasionally. Just my opinion. If you don't agree, you can go on Twitter. At JeffHisDunas is my handle, and you can yell at me. It's fine. Yell at me all you want. Patreon.com/DistantPeasant. PayPal.me/DistantPeasant. DistantPeasant.com. See you next time.